Amity University has been ranked among the top 3% universities globally by QS and Times Higher Education, the world's leading university ranking organizations. It has been ranked India's #1 not-for-profit private university for the past 7 years. Amity has also set a new standard of academic excellence in India by becoming Asia's only not-for-profit university to be awarded US Regional Accreditation, as well as India's only university to be accredited by the UK's Quality Assurance Agency for Higher Education. The university is part of the not-for-profit Amity Education Group, established more than 2 decades ago by the Chauhan family. Today, the group is home to over 175,000 brilliant students, pursuing over 400 programs in 60 diverse disciplines across 9 universities and 26 schools. Amity Group's vision of establishing a global knowledge network has led to establishing international campuses in London, Singapore, Dubai, New York, San Francisco, Amsterdam, Abu Dhabi, Sharjah, Tashkent, Mauritius, Nairobi, and South Africa. Amity's strong focus on research and innovation has led to the filing of more than 1,200 patents, which, according to the Controller General of Patents in India, is the highest number of patents filed by any individual Indian university. Amity is also engaged in conducting more than 300 high-end government-funded as well as international research projects, including those funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, United States Agency for International Development, and the Leverhulme Trust, UK. In the field of management, the university has developed more than 2,500 case studies in recent years that have been bought in 106 countries by over 2,300 leading institutions and organizations. The university has also pioneered the concept of industry-led institutions, where leading organizations such as the multinational conglomerate Tata, the UK's Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, and the Confederation of Indian Industry (CII) have set up institutions in partnership with Amity on campus. Attracting some of the most brilliant students, Amity has instituted India's largest private scholarship programs, benefiting over 25,000 students. These students are blazing a trail of success, having filed over 100 patents and published 1,500 Scopus-indexed research papers. It has also awarded over 2,000 PhD fellowships to brilliant researchers to carry out path-breaking research in thrust areas that will impact the development of the country. The award-winning Innovation Incubator on campus has nurtured more than 100 companies and attracted investments of over $40 million. The campus also has many high-end research centers, including ones set up with Nobel laureates.
Good morning, everyone. As per the vision of Honorable Founder President Sir and Honorable Chancellor Sir, Amity Directorate of Management and Allied Areas ADMA, under the guidance of Professor Dr. Gurinder Singh, Honorable Group Vice Chancellor and Director General ADMA, and Professor Dr. Ramanjit Singh, Director ADMA, is organizing the ADMA webinar series. This is the 21st webinar of the series. On behalf of Amity University and ADMA, I, Dr. Pranay Verma, Professor of Marketing, welcome to the webinar. Today's speaker, Professor Dr. Ananish Chaudhary, who is currently founder and director of DECIDE, the University of Auckland Business Decision Making Lab, and Professor of Experimental Economics at the Faculty of Business and Economics, the University of Auckland, New Zealand. I also welcome to the dais the Director of ADMA, Dr. Ramanjit Singh, to this event, who constantly encourages all of us. Also welcome to this event are the Associate Editor of all ADMA journals, Dr. Kirandeep Bedi, and the Editorial Assistant at ADMA, Ms. Soji Thomas. Today's discussion is on the topic, Decision making in a pandemic. The phenomenon of pandemic and lockdown is new for all. Without any prior experience and knowledge, taking a decision is a problem. Probably we need to be intuitive. We expect to update more to our knowledge from today's session. Now I request Dr. Kirandeep Bedi to introduce the speaker to the attendees. Meanwhile, I would request the YouTube viewers to mention their name and email in the YouTube chat box.
Thank you, sir. Hearty welcome to all present here. We are really glad to have amongst us today Professor Dr. Ananish Chaudhary, who is currently founder and director of DECIDE, the University of Auckland Business Decision Making Lab, and Professor of Experimental Economics at the Faculty of Business and Economics, the University of Auckland, New Zealand. The University of Auckland has ranked number 1 in Times Higher Education University Impact Rankings 2020 and is ranked 81 in QS World University Rankings 2021. Previously, Professor Chaudhary held academic positions at Harvard Kennedy School, Howard University, Cambridge, USA, Rutgers University, USA, Washington State University, and Wellesley College, USA. He holds a PhD from the Rutgers University, USA. Professor Chaudhary's research interests include experimental economics, economic development, and applied microeconomics. He has published widely in leading international scholarly journals and is the author of multiple books and edited volumes, including the books of behavioral economics and experiments in economics, Playing Fair with Money, both published by Routledge, and the forthcoming Research Agenda in Experimental Economics to be published by Edward Elgar. Dr. Chaudhary is involved in an editorial capacity with a large number of leading scholarly journals, including Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, Journal of Economic Psychology, Journal of Behavioral and Experimental Economics, and Nature Scientific Reports. The research papers in economics database ranks him amongst the top 5% of authors in economics across the world. He has won multiple grants both from the Royal Society of New Zealand, Masterden Fund, and the Australian Research Council. He has served on the Evolution and Human and Behavioral Sciences panel of the Royal Society of New Zealand, Marsden Fund. He has received multiple Research Excellence Awards and in 2018 received the Distinguished Contribution Award from the Faculty of Business and Economics at the University of Auckland. He writes frequently for the New Zealand Herald and other media outlets, and his research is often cited in the popular media. Now, may I request Professor Dr. Ramanjeet Singh, Director, ADMA, to welcome Professor Dr. Ananish Chaudhary. Over to you, sir. I think there is, yeah.
Can we see you?
Yes, sir. I think there is some connectivity issue. So,
Dr. Ananish?
yeah, okay. I think there is some connectivity issue with Dr. Ramanjeet's side. So, sir, may I have the honor to invite you to share your views on the topic decision making in the pandemic? Over to you, Dr. Ananish.
Hi, thank you for having me. As you know, in New Zealand, the original inhabitants are the Maori, and the Maori language is quite well ingrained in New Zealand society. So when we give talks and things, we typically start by saying kia ora, which is hello, haere mai, welcome. And then we usually say tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, which means welcome, welcome, 3 times welcome to all of you. So thank you very much for having me here. And let me get started. It's a great pleasure. I have been to many other places in India, but not to universities, not to Amity. Hopefully I can do that sometime soon. So before I get started, you probably figured out, I'm originally from Calcutta. I went to Presidency College, And then I went to Jawaharlal Nehru University. And then I went to study at Rutgers University in the US, and I taught in the US for a while, and now I've been in New Zealand for a number of years now. So yes, so now I can get back to watching cricket, which I couldn't watch in the United States. And I have two daughters who were born in New Zealand. So when New Zealand plays India, it's very tense in my household because I, of course, root for India and my daughters root for New Zealand. My daughters, though, have been to India many times, so they feel a bit difficult. They find it a challenge to who should they support, New Zealand or India. So anyway, why don't I get started? Just to let you know, I actually have a much bigger screen off to my left. So often I'm going to be looking there instead of directly at the camera. Okay, I hope you can see my screen. It says decision making in a pandemic.
Yes, sir, it's visible.
Okay. All right, so I'll get started. Let me just say a few things. So when Professor Singh asked me to give a seminar, he also said, do you want to talk a little bit about COVID-19, etc. So I'm going to talk about that, but this is not exactly my core research area, though I do work on this. So I do a lot of work in experimental economics, but I have done a fair bit of thinking and writing on this topic and how some of the things I work with or work on apply to COVID-19. So why don't you get started? So I will start with a naked act of self-promotion. So this talk is based on, I have a forthcoming book called Behavioral Economics and Experiments. So if those of you who teach some of this material, you might want to take a look at this book. This will be coming out in early 2021. So it's sort of a comprehensive coverage of topics in behavioral experimental economics meant for, you can do it either at undergraduate or master's level. And I'm also working on a new book called Uncommon Sense, or Why We Lost Our Minds Over COVID-19. And I'll see, depending on time, I'll see if I can touch upon some of my current research in some of these areas. Okay, so let's get started. So one of the big issues with decision making in a pandemic really is the uncertainty, right? So these are situations of extreme uncertainty, fear, apprehension, stress. And so the question is, how do we go about making good decisions in such scenarios? Now, I'm going to present you a view of what happened in this pandemic and how the world responded to it. Some of you, I'm assuming, will not agree with some of this. Some of you may, and those of you who don't agree, that's fine. All I want to convince you is that there is different ways of looking at what we did and why we did it and whether it made sense. So as humans, we all crave certainty. And we are not very good at dealing with events that's uncertain because we feel a loss of control. And this in turn, the fact that we are under cognitive stress and the fact that these are kind of new, unique scenarios we find ourselves in, often make us vulnerable to making some systematic errors of judgment that often add to the problem. So let me tell you what I'm talking about. So in talking about decision making in a pandemic, I'll of course talk about lockdowns. You have had a very long lockdown, other countries have too. So I'll talk a little bit about the opportunity cost of lockdowns, and I'll ask, are lockdowns such a good idea or not? I'll talk about what is commonly referred to as issues of framing and availability. For instance, asking the question, how many people will die, is quite different from saying how many people will live. And finally, I'll talk about the fact that human beings, most of us, even those of us with PhDs, we are not really intuitive statisticians. We struggle with matters of probabilities. So when this pandemic started, and again, I know you're supposed to ask questions at the end, but if there's something that is not clear and you want me to clarify something, please feel free to say so, or just raise, I think you should be able to raise your hand, etc. So now when this pandemic started, the major issue was what we called flattening the curve, right? So we wanted to make sure that our health systems didn't get overwhelmed. And so we wanted to introduce lockdowns so that people couldn't transmit the disease easily. And so the idea was to take, so the disease would peak somewhere here. This is much above the capacity of our health systems. So by locking down, you are essentially pushing the disease back and reducing the peak of the disease from here all the way to here, right? So that was the primary argument for locking down, that people couldn't go around and infect one another. And what did we do in order to achieve this? We implemented stringent lockdowns, right? We forced people to stay indoors, etc. India did want to for a fairly long time. I'm not sure what the popular view in India is, but in the Western countries, there is very strong support for these lockdowns. The popular view is that lockdowns are essential, they're good, and people who questioned lockdowns were faced with some severe backlash. I'm not sure if that's necessarily true in India, because the scenario has played out quite differently in rich countries than in relatively poorer countries. But anyway, so we implemented lockdowns where we forced people to stay indoors. Businesses were closed, offices were closed, schools were closed, universities, etc. Now, a lot of this was based on really a feeling that there were really two options. One was to lock everything down, and the other was to so-called let it rip, that if you don't lock down, you will have unchecked community transmission. The former lockdowns had massive support, but in reality, it wasn't quite this or that. There were many other options available along the way. And one thing I'll say now, and I'll probably repeat later on, is that a fundamental assumption of some of the mathematical modeling in this area was that faced with this pathogen, unless you forced people to stay indoors, they'll just go about their business just like before. But that's not entirely true, because when you know there's a disease going around, you would take some precautions. You would wash your hand, maybe wear a mask, maybe stay indoors if you're not feeling well, etc. I'll come back to this in a little bit. Okay. So as I said, a key mathematical key assumption was that people will not change their behavior. So if the mortality rate, let's say, is 1 in 100, then let us say in a country like the United States with 330 million people, 3.3 million people will die unless we lock everything down. The problem with this view is that even in the absence of government interventions, people will take some mitigating action so that the infection will probably not spread as much as that. Now, of course, COVID-19 is a deadly disease, and we do want to reduce mortality. However, when this pandemic started, I found this article. This is written by somebody called Thomas Inglesby. He's a specialist in infectious diseases, and he's writing an article along with collaborators in a journal called Biosecurity and Bioterrorism. And here is what Inglesby had to say. He says there are no historical observations or scientific studies that support the confinement by quarantine of groups of possibly infected people for extended periods. And so, according to the WHO, forced isolation and quarantine are ineffective and impractical, even though in this pandemic, the WHO actually was in favor of lockdowns before they switched their view and said, no, lockdowns may not be all that useful. This is Inglesby again. He's saying, despite this, mandatory large-scale quarantine continues to be considered as an option. And this reflects the views and conditions prevalent more than 50 years ago, when much less was known about the epidemiology of infectious diseases and where there was less international and domestic travel in a less densely populated world. So this was kind of the broad understanding in the epidemiological community of how to deal with infectious diseases. Except when COVID-19 hit, this is not what we did. So as you can see, I've pointed out here that on March 11th, WHO declared that COVID-19 was a pandemic. Now, these are the OECD countries, which is kind of, the rich Western countries. And look what they all did. They had started closing workplaces already. And then within a span of about 2 weeks, almost all of these countries, or nearly 90% of these countries, all enacted school closures, closed public events, forced people to stay indoors. There were no internal mobility, workplace closures, and things along those lines. So pretty much every country, and this picture, this is from a paper in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences. The picture won't be that different in developing countries either. But the problem now, of course, is even if you flatten the curve, let me just go back to this slide for a minute. So remember, so you have flattened the curve, but the problem is that the area under the curve, whether it's the pink curve or the blue curve, the area under these curves is the same. So all you have done is you have prevented infections happening quickly. You have just pushed that back to some time in the future, right? So essentially you have decided that rather than having all the infections now, I'm going to have them in the future. That's what flattening the curve does. It doesn't do much else than that. But you could certainly argue that, well, it does reduce pressure on healthcare systems. I'll talk a little bit. I'm not sure how much time I'll have. I have a lot of slides here. So even if you flatten the curve, the area remains unchanged. So you have suppressed the spread of the disease. But once you remove those restrictions, the disease will start to spread again because you haven't gotten rid of the disease. It will stay around in the community. Then once you allow people to move around or allow people to come and go across borders, the disease will start to spread. Unless, of course, you are willing to keep things locked down for a very long time. And sitting in India, I'm sure you would agree that India's experience was that keeping things locked down for a very long time was just not an option. It was devastating, particularly to poorer people, people like migrating workers. So India effectively gave up on locking down even when the disease was circulating quite a bit, because you cannot keep a whole country locked down for a very long period of time. Or in other countries, you could say, well, we are going to keep things locked down till a vaccine appears. So Neil Ferguson of Imperial College, who first did some of this modeling, he was suggesting countries lock down for as long as 18 months to 2 years. I'm pretty sure you would agree that that's really not an option for most countries in the world. But let's continue, and I'm sure you'll have questions, and I'll try and address those. Okay. Now the question is, what do lockdowns do? Well, certainly lockdowns flatten the curve. They push the infections to some date in the future. But surprisingly, lockdowns have no effect on actual death rates. They do not reduce mortality. They do not reduce mortality across countries. And no, that's not me. That's a different Chowdhury. They do not reduce mortality across countries. They do not reduce mortality longitudinally within countries or across different counties in the United States. And we knew this reasonably early on. By May, June of this year, we knew that lockdowns were not reducing mortality. So simply put, if you did a correlation between death rates and lockdowns, the stringency of lockdowns, many of you will know that the COVID-19 virus tracking center at Oxford University provides data on how stringent these lockdowns were. If you just looked at correlations between death rates and stringency of lockdowns, you will not find a very strong correlation. And you know this sitting in India, because India had one of the most stringent lockdowns, and India's death rate wasn't per million of population, it was low, but India still had lots of deaths. Okay. So now let's think about how we approach decision-making problems, right? So this is part of the kind of work that I do. So psychologists typically say that we have kind of engaged in two types of thinking: system one thinking and system two thinking. System one is automatic, fast, intuitive, reflexive. You tell me something, I kind of come up with a narrative and I come up with a solution. COVID-19 infection, lockdown, great. System two, on the other hand, is typically deliberative, thoughtful, reflective, but it takes a fair amount of effort to engage system two and kind of think through. Let me tell you what I mean by some of these things. So you can think of system one as an elephant. So as soon as my brain receives a stimulus, I receive some information, what's the mortality rate, what's the case fatality rate, things like that, I immediately start thinking, oh my goodness, this is something that needs to be addressed. What do we do? You know, oh, somebody said this, let's do this. So the elephant kind of lurches into action. Now, once the elephant lurches into action, the elephant's rider, who's the system two, tries to turn the elephant around at times. But as I'm sure you understand, once an elephant sets forth, turning that elephant around is not necessarily that easy. It can be done, but it takes a fair amount of effort. Okay. Why am I saying this? Well, let me give you some examples. So in the immediate aftermath of the September 11, 2001 attacks, and chances are there are many students sitting in the audience, and some of them were born after that, or they were too young. But this was a very big event for many of us. When the World Trade Centers came crashing down, things like that, right? So in the immediate aftermath, many Americans decided that flying was too risky. Instead, they chose to drive. Estimates suggest that in the following year, an additional, not the average that happens every year, an additional 1,500 people died in car accidents as they drove on the roads. Now, remember, there were 4 planes that crashed, and the total number of people who died in those planes is less than 1,500. So in trying to avoid flying, because it was too risky, we decided to drive, and we lost a lot of lives. Now, this is fairly common, because when we are faced with these kinds of scenarios, we often tend to focus excessively on what we call identified lives, the lives that are right in front of us. So planes crashed, we don't want to drive. COVID-19, we must do everything in our power to prevent the COVID-19 deaths. But the problem with this view is that because we are so afraid of losing a large number of lives in a short period, and because we focus so much on identified lives, we miss out on the loss of what we call statistical lives. And these statistical lives may actually be much larger. What do I mean by statistical lives? Statistical lives are the lives lost that you cannot see. Why? Because these are scattered all over and not reported in the same breathless manner by the media or the news channels. Let me give you some examples. This is from the Telegraph of London in August. They're saying that there have been more than 6,700 extra deaths across the US in the past 2 months, of which just 203 involved coronavirus. Deaths from other causes are soaring. Millions of patients went untreated for killer diseases during lockdown. Among those under 65, the number of deaths caused by high blood pressure is up by 1/3. And I can give you many other figures like this. So here's the point, right? If you have lockdowns, you are going to save some COVID-19 lives, and that's great. But it's important to understand that by doing so, you are going to kill some other people from other causes. Most policymakers around the world seemed insufficiently aware of this trade-off. Most people seem to believe that we can lock down, reduce COVID deaths, and this will be a win-win. It will not come at the expense of anything else. This is incorrect. So here's a report from World Health Organization and report in New York Times. And again, sitting in India, I'm sure you would appreciate this. At least 80 million children around the world under the age of 1 were not vaccinated at the proper time. And as a result, this is going to lead, and is already leading, to a surge in cases of polio, measles, and things along those lines. Now, I'm sure you would agree that this has a cost as well. So David Miles is a professor at Imperial College, and he's a member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England. Now, one of the things that people said when I was making arguments like this was, hey, we don't put a value on human lives. But we do all the time. We value human lives when we write insurance policies. We value human lives when we sue someone for damages. So if you wanted to sue a company for, like we had the Union Carbide disaster in Bhopal, if you want to sue them, you are suing them on the basis of the lives lost, and you are putting a dollar value on those lives. So we do it all the time. So what David Miles is saying, he's saying, look, let's think about what proportion of GDP we might lose. Now, you can think about this 2 ways. One is GDP loss. Now, you could argue, well, even if we did nothing and COVID-19 spread, GDP would have been lost, sure. But bear in mind that in the second quarter of 2020, which is April to June, the Indian economy shrank by 25%. This is a massive amount of shrinkage. And this has massive implications in terms of jobs and lives. The British economy and that same period shrank by 20%. These were the 2 largest drops among all countries in the world. India and United Kingdom were by far the largest outliers in terms of how much GDP was lost. So David Miles is saying, okay, let's take a look at using data from Sweden and many other places. He's saying, let's look at how many lives did we save? And let's look at some indicative loss in GDP. So if you calculate the net cost and net benefit, then if your GDP dropped by 9% in the United Kingdom and you managed to save 440,000 lives, you would still experience a net loss of $68 billion. These are billions of dollars. On the other hand, suppose you have a 9% loss in GDP, but your lockdown saved only about 20,000 lives, then you would experience a drop in GDP of $194 billion. If you had a 15% drop in GDP and you saved 20,000 lives, you would experience a loss of $324 billion. 20% loss in GDP, $435 billion. I don't want to get into too much of a detail here, but I'm sure most of you, by this time, these things have become very popular. You know that there's this idea of a quality adjusted life year. So in New Zealand, the New Zealand government has a value. The Ministry of Health has a value, and the value is approximately 60,000 New Zealand dollars, which is about 40,000 US dollars. And if you want, multiply the New Zealand dollars by 50 to get Indian equivalent. In New Zealand, the Ministry of Health values human life, 1 year of human life, at about $60,000 for an adult. Estimates suggest that the restrictions we imposed will cost us approximately $1.2 to $1.7 million per year of life saved, even though we value it at $60,000. So once again, let me reiterate. No one is saying that we should not try and save lives from COVID-19. All that we are saying, or I'm saying, is that when you try and do that, you are sacrificing lives elsewhere. And it seems to make sense that you would want the benefits to outweigh the costs. For instance, you would want the total number of lives saved to be minimized, or in some senses, those of you who are in economics, we always tell our students about Jeremy Bentham and the utilitarian principle, right? Which says the greatest good of the greatest number. So we want to make sure that we achieve the greatest benefit or the minimum cost. But if I save X lives from COVID, but lose Y lives elsewhere, and Y is bigger than X, then it's not clear that this is a good trade-off. Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about framing and availability. So suppose I asked you this question. I said, rank these in order of deaths worldwide. And I said, which of the following do you think caused the most deaths? Terrorism, war, and civil conflict, nutritional deficiencies, cancers, emphysema, etc., and respiratory illness. If you ask people this question, or when people ask this question, a vast majority of people say that terrorism causes the most loss of lives. This is not correct. Worldwide, most people die from respiratory infections. In the United States, which is particularly afraid of terrorism, more people die from drunk driving than from terrorism. Yet no one seems to make such a fuss about drunk driving. Why? Because terrorism, which kills a lot of people quickly or in one event, makes the headlines. Drunk driving, that kills many more people, but scattered all over the place, don't make the headlines in the same way. So now let me show you a few other things. Some of you may have seen this. This is called the Mueller-Lyer illusion. So my question to you is, if you look between the arrows, if you look at these line segments, A and B, which one is bigger? If you ask people this question, and I'm sure some of you, I'm sure some of you are thinking this, most people say that line A is longer than line B. This is not right, because the two line segments are the same exact length. It's the arrows that make A look longer than B. The problem, of course, is now if I go back to the previous slide, A still looks longer than B. So it's as if once I have seen an information, it becomes difficult to unsee it. Unlearning something becomes a bit of a problem. Now let me ask you a slightly different question, and I want you to try this. So I have a red line on the left, and I have three black lines on the right, A, B, and C. Which black line do you think is the same length as the red line on the left, A, B, or C? So I want you to think about it for a minute. And now, suppose I told you, and I had a whole bunch of people tell you that the red line is the same length as the B line. Would you be convinced? A lot of people seem to be convinced by this, except the red line is actually the same length as the C line. But if a large number of people say it, and there's a famous experiment done by a guy called Solomon Asch back in the 50s. If a large number of people said the red line is the same length as the B line, then a lot of people would actually change their mind and go along with the group. So this is a type of conformism bias that exists in all of us. Now, I'll show you why these things play a role when it came to COVID-19 or when it comes to any kind of disaster or stressful scenarios. Why do these things matter? See, framing makes a big difference. And some of you may have seen this example before. Suppose I asked you to choose between two treatments that affect 600 people. Except treatment A will save 200 lives, but kill 400 people. Treatment B, on the other hand, is probabilistic. It's got 1/3 chance where no one would die, which basically means that in expectations, you will save 200 lives, and a 2/3 chance that everyone would die, which means 2/3 times 600 is 400. So these are kind of the same. A will certainly save 200, not save 400. B will save 200 in expectation because that's 1/3 times 600. Sorry. And this is 2/3 times 600. So one is a sure thing, the other is a probability, but they roughly mean the same. This is taken from the work done by Daniel Kahneman and Nemo Tversky. And this is in my book, but it's also in Kahneman's book called Thinking Fast and Slow. But now suppose I ask people the following question. I say, well, here's what I call a positive framing. Positive framing, treatment A saves 200 lives. Treatment B has 1/3 chance of saving 600 people and 2/3 chance of saving no one. So in expectation, the same thing, 200 lives saved and 400 deaths. Or suppose I give you this question in the following form. I put it in a negative framing that 400 people will die. So understand that these two statements are equivalent. For treatment A, saves 200 lives means 400 people will die. And the same is true of treatment B. In expectation, they are the same thing. These are equivalent statements. Just look at treatment A. Saves 200 lives out of 600, which means it kills 400 people. But turns out that this makes a huge difference. When it's placed in a positive frame, meaning when you say treatment A saves 200 lives, majority of people, nearly 80% of people choose treatment A. But when you tell them that treatment A will lead to 400 deaths, now they switch and choose treatment B. That doesn't make a lot of sense because these two statements are the same. 400 people will die or 200 lives will be saved. Okay. Why is this important? Before I get to that, let me give you another example. So now here, of course, the expected values are the same. So let's play around with expected values. This is a little bit of math, but hopefully I'll take you through slowly. I will run out of time very quickly. So let me just go ahead. Suppose I say, do you want to choose A, which has an 80% chance of a lottery that gives you 80% chance of winning $4,000. So 80% times 4,000, expected gain is 3,200. Or would you take $3,000? So do you want to take $3,200 in expectation or $3,000 for sure? When given this choice, 80% of people in a study chose option B. They took $3,000 for sure. But when they were asked, would you take 80% chance of losing 4,000? So there's expected loss of 3,200. Or would you take a loss, sure loss of 3,000? The vast majority of people chose the larger expected loss. So if you didn't quite get all the numbers, don't worry about it. What I'm simply saying is that when it comes to positive things, when it comes to gains, we choose smaller, surer numbers. But when it comes to losses, we choose larger probabilistic numbers. So we prefer smaller, surer gains over larger probabilistic gains, but we actually prefer larger probabilistic losses over smaller, surer losses. Why is this relevant? Because faced with COVID-19, what we did was we decided to save the smaller, surer loss of lives, even though it was relatively clear that the probabilistic or statistical lives were most likely going to be larger. There's another piece of the puzzle here. I'll get to that in a minute. So when COVID-19 first hit, and this is where the framing or the initial impact, the elephant launching into action comes in, the World Health Organization said that the case fatality rate was ratio was 3.5%. So that's a 3%. So this means that 100 people who get COVID-19, around 3 will die. This is, of course, a very large number. I mean, it scale up to millions of people in China, India, United States. But is this a meaningful number? Because what the case fatality rate is telling you is these are only the cases that we have found, that have been identified, that have tested positive for COVID-19. But what we really want to know is not the case fatality ratio, but the infection fatality ratio, which means how many people got the disease, whether they tested positive or not, and how many people died. Turns out that this number, the infection fatality ratio, is much lower. Why? Because suppose you know of 100 cases and out of those 3 people died, then you would say your case fatality ratio is 3%, 3 out of 100. But now suppose there are another 200 people who also have COVID, but have either not been tested or are asymptomatic, etc., and none of them passed away, then you now have in your community 300 people who caught the disease, but only 3 of them died, which means the actual fatality ratio is 1%. So it's 1/3 of what you initially thought, except a lot of people got locked on to the initial 3%. And a lot of the mathematical models use that number. Subsequently, the United States Center for Disease Control said the IFR is really just about 0.7%. So let's understand what that means. What that means that out of every 1,000 people who catch the disease, only 7 will die and 993 will survive. This really means that if you catch COVID-19, some of you will be badly sick, some of us, and I have elderly parents, I have elderly family back in India, I know people who have had COVID, but 993 or 99% of them will actually recover. Or if you want it like that, you could say 1 out of every 153, that's exactly 0.65% will die, and 152 will survive. So the survival rate of COVID-19 is 99% or more. As of November 2020, 240,000 people have died of COVID-19 in the USA. And this is big news all over the world. In 2018, which is the last year that we have complete data for, more than 650,000 people died from respiratory illnesses. 600,000 died from cancer. 167,000 died from accidents and other injuries. 85,000 died from diabetes. 51,000 died from kidney disease, and around 48,000 died from suicides. So sitting in India, which will pay a fairly high price in terms of lost GDP, how much are you willing to sacrifice for a disease that has a 99% survival rate? Also bear in mind that the fatality ratio is heavily skewed towards the elderly. The average age of death is 82 years. This is also relevant because COVID-19 was more deadly in Western Europe than it was in India. Why? Because Western Europe and US on general have a much older population. The median age in these countries is around 45 years. In India, the median age is around 26 years. This is because if you're less than 60 years or so, you really don't have a lot of threat from COVID-19. So a risk of 1 in 152 is not that different from many other risks we take in our day-to-day lives. According to John Ioannidis of Stanford, if you are under the age of 65, in large parts of the United States, for instance, this risk is similar to driving between 13 and 100 miles per day. So if you drive 20, 25, 30 miles per day, you have the same risk of death from a car accident. Okay. I'm rapidly running out of time, so I'm going to finish off by talking about very quickly. I'm going to skip some of these things, but just briefly say that when we talk about probabilities, two things are important. One is we need to understand if events are connected or not connected, and events that are, events that are connected and events that are not connected. So what is the connection with vaccines from COVID-19? I'm going to skip some of this. I'll come back and talk about it if I have time. Sorry, I'm going to skip a whole bunch of slides. So now, we are now reasonably optimistic that we have vaccines. But first of all, I don't think the vaccines are all that effective for the following reasons. And people are severely underestimating what's going to happen with the vaccines. It typically takes 8 to 10 years to develop an effective vaccine. The fastest vaccine ever developed is for mumps, and it took 4 years. Varicella for chickenpox, type A and B influenza took 28 years. Rotavirus, human papillomavirus took 15 years. This that we give to all kids in India, DPT, took 11 years to develop. This is sometimes called the pediatric vaccine. In the case of COVID-19, we believe that we could find a vaccine within 18 months. There are two problems with this. One is this compressed time frame has essentially meant that the vaccines that are being developed may not be very effective, because they may not be effective in preventing serious illness, person-to-person transmission, etc. But let's leave that aside for a minute. Here's the other problem. The other problem is, as humans, we typically tend to overweight small probabilities and underweight large probabilities. What do I mean by that? What I mean is two things, really. One is that when you have pushed a probability down to a reasonably low level, the cost of trying to minimize that becomes prohibitive. But what this is saying is that, look, these are probabilities: 0.2, 0.20%, 40%, 60%, 8%, 80%, 100%. If we treated these probabilities exactly objectively, then we get this line here. But we don't. Most of us, we tend to put a higher weight on small probability. So the way I have done this here, you have somebody who's looking at a 20% probability event, but treating it as a 40% event. This is a very common finding across many, many subject pools. And here is something where you have an 80% event, but you are underweighting that, you are treating it as a 60% event. Why is this relevant? Because these two events are actually quite different. One has a 20% chance, the other has a 80% chance. So the second event is 4 times as likely as the first event. But in your mind, you are overweighting the first one, thinking of it as 40%. You are underweighting the second one, thinking of it as 60%. So the events don't seem that different to you. Why is this? Well, because I'm going to skip again some of this. Because an effective vaccine requires many things. This is what is called a connected or conjunctive event. A lot of things have to fall in line. So you must develop an effective vaccine. You must produce enough. Some of you may know this. The vaccines that have been developed by Pfizer and Moderna are what are called mRNA, or messenger RNA vaccines. This is a radically new type of vaccine that has never been tried before. Because most vaccines that we do, when we give kids BCG or DPT, you essentially introduce a very small amount of the live vaccine into the skin, which trains the body to respond to the disease. Messenger RNA vaccines work completely differently. And I'm going to skip the technical details. So you have to have a vaccine, you have to have enough production. Messenger RNA vaccines need to be kept at minus 70 degrees Celsius, which is the temperature of approximately the South Pole. And then you have to distribute them around the world, and you have to keep them frozen. And all of these things have to happen for us to vaccinate 7 billion people around the world. Is this possible? Yes. Is it going to happen soon? No. And now, I'm not going to that. One of the big questions is that these companies have patent rights, so you are not going to be able to produce generic versions of these very quickly. The Serum Institute of India, for instance, can produce generic versions of these vaccines. They could have done it, or they can do it with the AstraZeneca vaccine, but they cannot do it with the Moderna or Pfizer vaccines. Serum Institute can do this, and they can do it fairly cheaply. But unless you allow them to produce generic versions of these vaccines may be very expensive. India may be able to do it. It's not clear. What about countries in sub-Saharan Africa? So I wrote this article recently where I said, very soon then, we might have a scenario where you have the vaccine have countries, maybe rich countries, India maybe, if SRI manages to get the AstraZeneca vaccine. And then you're going to have the vaccine have not countries. And there are serious implications for these countries in terms of travel. What about people traveling to these countries? What about people from these countries who travel to other countries to work, to study? most countries around the world have stopped international students. So countries like New Zealand, Australia, Canada, England, their universities are very heavily dependent on international students. We get at Auckland, we get a huge amount of students from China and increasingly India. None of them are allowed to come now, and not clear when they can come. Universities are going to go bankrupt. I'm just talking about universities, but this applies to many others. Okay, I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to skip a whole bunch of things. I'm going to talk about political ideology a bit, but I'm going to go skip a whole bunch of things, and I'm going to finish up so that I can answer a few questions, hopefully. So my point here is that when we are faced with these stressful decision-making scenarios, pandemic, disasters, it's important to understand that there are trade-offs here. If you decide to do one thing, you will decide not to do something else. If you lock countries down, you will save COVID-19 lives, but you are going to lose some other lives, children who didn't get vaccinated, people who didn't get treated for cancer. So it's very important to be mindful of these trade-offs and the opportunity cost. So there's really no win-win here, that even though we would like to have one. It's important to pay attention to disconfirming evidence. So very often we tend to focus on evidence that confirms our beliefs or the popular narrative, but actively listen to what the other evidence is. What are some of the detractors saying? What evidence are they providing? We don't understand probabilities very well. And therefore, we don't understand that 0.65% probability is fairly low. And to push this down even lower would be possibly prohibitively expensive. I don't want to make a big deal out of this, but when COVID-19, when India, obviously, there was a lot of discussion on COVID-19. My relatives in India were talking COVID-19, but in and around West Bengal, Cyclone Amphan killed 80 people. And no one really seemed bothered all that much because everybody was focused on COVID-19. And I haven't talked about this, that our economics is not divorced from our politics. That's part of my recent work, but I haven't talked about it, maybe another time. Okay, so I need to acknowledge a few people. These are my collaborators in some of this work: Quinton Atkinson, Chris Sibley, Professor of Psychology, my PhD students, Scott Claessens and Kyle Fisher. And I also need to acknowledge support from the Royal Society of New Zealand and the University of Auckland for funding a lot of my work here. Okay, thank you very much. That's my story. And I'm happy to answer questions if there's time.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Anish. It's it's wonderful listening to you. And we have received several compliments.
Okay, thank you.
These are really engrossed, and they have, many of them have written that interesting session, and there are several questions which have popped up. So I'll ask two questions. So
sure.
This first question I'll ask has been raised by Dr. Jyotirmay Satpathy, and he asks, how does choosing of alternatives usher a pathway of neuro-based decision mechanism? And then the second part of his question is, what is the thin line difference between choosing alternative and preferring alternative? Choosing alternative and preferring alternative. Mobin, I can't hear. Can you hear him?
No, sir, I also can't hear. Sir, we are unable to hear you, sir.
Dr. Anish, we can't hear you. Yeah, I think, yeah. Now we can hear you. Please.
Sorry about that.
No problem. No. Please continue, sir. Sir, may I repeat the question? We can't hear you, sir, once again. We can't hear you, sir.
Hear me now?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, I'll just use, okay. Can you just repeat the first part of the question on, was it on
yeah.
neuro? Yes.
He asked, how does choosing of alternatives usher in a pathway of neuro-based decision mechanism? And the second part is difference between choosing alternative and preferring
Correct.
alternative.
Okay. So,
Not
so
alternative, an alternative.
correct. An
alternative.
Correct. So I don't know the answer to the first question, and I'm not sure if there must be research on that. I don't know the neural pathways of some of these things. There's a lot of work. I'm not a neuroscientist, so I cannot specifically talk about it. I can probably say a few things, but they won't probably be all that meaningful, because what you have here in terms of neural pathways is you have the emotional centers of your brain. Let's say things like the amygdala, where emotions are formed, which are sending you some signals. And you also have what's called the prefrontal cortex, which is trying to make an executive decision. Should we go this way? Should we go that way, etc. There's a lot of work. I don't specifically know. There's not any work on COVID-19 at this point because it's so recent. The second question is, it is actually very difficult to understand what the alternatives are. In the sense, making these choices is difficult. Governments have a hard choice. It is hard when a lot of people are dying. So when it came to the initial lockdowns, I don't think anybody objected to some of the early lockdowns because we really needed some time to figure things out. But over time, we accumulated enough evidence, and there is literally no evidence that seems to suggest that the benefit of lockdowns outweigh the cost of lockdowns. All available evidence suggests that when you factor in all these other costs, the costs are actually much larger. So really, it's a debate now between two different viewpoints. And this is not a question of science really anymore. It's a question of philosophy and ethics and morality. The question is, you have one group of people who are saying, we need to save the COVID-19 lives that we can see right in front of our eyes. The other group is saying, okay, but please understand that in doing so, you are sacrificing many lives elsewhere. And those additional lives are probably much larger than the COVID-19 lives you are saving. So the first group is saying, but well, that's a probabilistic event that may happen, but that's exactly why I said that even though that probability is much larger, in our minds, we are underweighting that probability. We are saying, well, you know what, maybe not so many lives will be lost after all. So let's save the lives right in front of our eyes. So this is an ethical, moral question. What I'm saying is that you could probably make arguments on either side, but what happened in the COVID-19 debate is the people who made this argument about the statistical lives were completely laughed out of court. People said, oh, no, you are heartless, you are callous, but that's not quite right. We are saying, look, in lives and lives, you have to make a choice. And these are tough choices, but you got to make a choice. That's my point. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I hope so. Sir, we have received questions for system 1 and system 2. No.
Okay.
So for this, I will take two questions. One question is by Dr. Sandeep Bhasin from MIT University. He asks, how do you keep personal biases of both system 1 and system 2 thinking, especially when you have taken decisions without taking the stakeholders' consent? And another question, which is actually by Dr. Jyotirmay, the first question, I mean, the person who asked the first question, can we model a system 3 by adding systems 1 and 2? So I'm asking you two questions. One is, how do you keep the personal biases out of both the systems? when you have taken decisions without taking the stakeholders' consent? And secondly, can you develop a new model by system 1 plus system 2 is equal to system 3?
Okay, so the first question, the traditional view is that when faced with a problem, this is very common, right? We say this, oh, go with your gut feelings. What does your gut tell you? What's your intuition, right? And we often act on those things. The primary problem is that if it's a decision that is very commonplace, that you make lots of times, then relying on your gut may actually be okay. But if it's a problem that's completely unfamiliar to you, relying on your gut may not be okay. So relying on your gut when you're doing grocery shopping may be fine, but relying on your gut when you buy a house, probably not so much, because you don't buy a house every day, right? So the question is, one important question then is, how much expertise do I have at the task in hand, right? And I think the problem, to answer the first question, is that the cognitive biases come in when we apply gut feelings to situations where we do not have a lot of expertise. And so the idea is that if you now engage your system 2, then you would be able to avoid some of those gut feelings. And the way you do that is by playing what's called devil's advocate. Do you know what the devil's advocate comes from? The Catholic Church, where when people are raised to sainthood, the Catholic Church had appointed somebody called the devil's advocate to argue against that person being made a saint. Pope John Paul II, the second, many of you, he went to India, so I think you may remember him. Pope John Paul II did away with this office in the Vatican of the devil's advocate. Guess what has happened since then? A lot more people have been sainted, right? So what I'm saying is, so if you look at my books or my writings, I talk about confirmation bias, questioning information. So these are ways, there are de-biasing techniques that I talk about in my forthcoming book and other books. The second question is actually quite intriguing, and something that I've been thinking of is, I don't know if it's system 3, but if Professor Satpathy may know, that the philosopher David Hume said that when it comes to human beings, reason must necessarily be a slave to passion. Now, the question is, what does passion mean? Because a lot of people think of passion as emotions, but it's possible that it might be possible to think about passion in 2 different ways. One is emotion, anger, fear, hate. The other part of passion might be values, trust, reciprocity, fairness, altruism. So it is possible that you can combine system 1 and system 2, both with emotions and values, right? So now we are talking maybe system 3 and system 4. But this is an open question, which I don't think has a good answer at this point.
Okay. We have a very interesting question by Dr. Nixon Omoro. He asks, decisions within a pandemic context have to be made under an overwhelming time pressure and amid high scientific uncertainty with minimal quality evidence and potential disagreements among experts and models. So based on your presentations, he's asking you, based on your presentations and statistics, how can we improve on decision making during this period? Would you agree to this statement?
That's absolutely valid. That's absolutely valid. This is time pressure. So what I'm saying is that really there are a couple of things I'm saying. One is, I don't think anyone is saying, why did you make this decision? Why, for instance, I don't think anyone is saying, why did the government decide to lock down early on? There was uncertainty, there was not enough evidence, that's fine. So my first point is that I don't think the Indian government or any other government was adequately conceding to the fact that lockdowns may save COVID lives but lockdowns would cost lives elsewhere. I don't think any governments around the world were really paying a lot of attention to this first issue. But once again, as I say, the initial response isn't the question. The question is, why persist with lockdowns when the evidence becomes overwhelming? For instance, why is England or France locking down even now when we know that the evidence for lockdowns is fairly minor? And so the real one question here then to answer the questioner is that why should we keep doing something which seems to be not of great benefit? And because I skipped a lot of things, one of the things we talk about in economics or in management is the sunk cost fallacy. Why is that relevant? Because a lot of governments, we kept going on with lockdowns, even though we realized that the costs were outweighing the benefits. Why? Because of the sunk cost fallacy, because we had already sacrificed so much. How can we bail out now? But it's a sunk cost fallacy that kept United States and Vietnam for many, many years, even after it was obvious that there was no victory there. The costs were already sunk. You understand this, right? That you teach this. The sunk cost fallacy. If the cost is sunk, then what you should consider is from this point on, what is the additional benefit? What is the additional cost? If the additional cost is much higher than the additional benefit, then it doesn't make sense to say, oh, we have already incurred so much sunk cost, we should keep going, right? Because that's very typical. We say, we got to keep going because, we have done so much already. So that's what I'm saying. So I'm not saying people made mistakes. I'm saying that, there were times when things could have been questioned and evidence looked at that people didn't look at.
Yeah, thank you, sir. And this would be the last question because we would be
sure.
At a time. And this question has been asked by Dr. Yusuf Suleiman from Nigeria. This question is actually related to what you have been answering. How do you make decision in pandemic when you need to sack some of your best staff who are actually hardworking due to your financial hiccups?
So this is something we are facing right now. And University of Auckland is looking at laying off workers because we have lost a lot of revenue. Many other universities are. And my view, this is kind of very detailed. I wrote to the Vice Chancellor saying that, look, we should not be laying people off under any circumstances now because people have made enormous sacrifices during this year. And it seems very cruel to tell them, okay, now you need to move on. So even if it means borrowing or running some debt, we should keep these people on at least in the near future. Again, see, those are the costs, right? So you have saved COVID-19 lives, but when you lay off these people, that will have implications for both their lives and their livelihoods. For instance, we know that large-scale unemployment leads to lower life expectancy. So if in India, 10 million people lose jobs and they lose a year of their lives, you have lost 10 million life years. These are costs also. What I'm saying is that in making these policies, it seems governments were not really paying a lot of attention to these opportunity costs. I don't know a good answer. I mean, it's tough. I'm doing this here right now. We are hoping, just to answer your question, we are hoping enough people will retire. Because as opposed to India, New Zealand or United States, we don't have mandatory retirement. So you can keep working as long as you want. You can keep going till you're 75, 80, 85 years old, if you're fit. So we are hoping that some of the older people will retire, will save enough money and not have to lay people off.
That's a very tricky answer. Now, sir, thank you, Professor Ananish Chaudhary, for giving this wonderful presentation and answering the questions. There are still several questions which I have which I have not asked because of paucity of time, because lack of time.
Sure,
Now I
sure.
request Dr. Ramanjit Singh to give his vote of thanks and his views. Over to you, Dr. Ramanjit Singh, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Ananish. Thanks a lot for your wonderful presentation. The
Thank you.
topic chosen by you, decision making in a pandemic, that is a very important topic, very hot topic, and the much required topic to be discussed during this stressful situation during this pandemic period. And on behalf of the Honorable Founder President, Sir Dr. Ashok Chauhan, who is a big motivating force for all of us. He's always motivating, invite good people, good experts from across the globe who can add to our knowledge base, not only to the MET knowledge base, but to the global knowledge base. On behalf of our Honorable Chancellor, Dr. Atul Chauhan, who is a young dynamic Chancellor, we are thankful to you. And on behalf of our Honorable Group Vice Chancellor, Dr. Gurinder Singh, he's a big motivating force who is always motivating. Let's do something positive. And on behalf of my whole MET family across the globe, the directors, the faculty members, the research scholars, the students, we are thankful to you. We are really thankful to you for sparing your time, because we have been, I have been writing to you a number of times due to the time shortage. Yes, we always try. Yes, let's have some convenient day, because the time gap is also another thing.
Wow.
These days, if you see in MET, examinations are going on. Students are busy in the SRS examinations. Some faculty members are also busy conducting the examinations. And then we are really thankful to you for sparing your valuable time, yes, in discussing this wonderful topic. And I was just going through your slides. Yes, wonderful slides you have made, wonderful discussion, and we will certainly do something collaboratively. I will write to you after this webinar. Let's have some research collaborations where we can work together, both MET and the University of Auckland. And let me thank all attendees across the globe, because if we see, as is the people who are from Nigeria and as for this part of the world, I think they are 4.5 hours behind us, and it means at 5:30 or 6 a.m. they are there just to attend your webinar, just to listen to you. And a number of attendees from Philippines were there, Malaysia, Indonesia, even from USA and Canada. I'm thankful to all the attendees from across the globe for sparing their time also, because in case they are there, only then we are here. Because without the attendees, we can't do anything. I'm really thankful. And let me thank my whole IT team also, headed by Dr. Sodi, Mr. Mobin also, who is supporting us as a IT host. And very important, my small, very passionate and very dynamic team of EDMA, Dr. Barne Verma, who is moderating the session. He's always there. He is doing examination duty also. He's there in the campus, and he is sparing his time to moderate the session also. And Dr. Kirandeep Kaur, who is there helping in arranging the whole thing, in managing the whole webinar. Ms. Soji Thomas, who is always there to help us, to support all the events. And Dr. Ananish, yes, we are once again thankful to you, and let's work together. This is just a beginning of doing something collaboratively, but let's work together, let's do something together so that the whole world is benefited. Thank you, Dr. Ananish. Once again, we are thankful to you.
Professor Singh, I know we are really short of time, but let me just say one quick thing, because this is very relevant. Thank you very much for having me. Sorry it took me a while to organize this, but just let you know, hopefully I can come to MET at some point in the future. But New Zealand has the University of Auckland has a very strong India focus. So I traveled with a group of people to India in 2019, and we visited a bunch of places, and we actually have a joint PhD program with IIT Delhi and IIT Kharagpur. And we visited places like Symbiosis, we went to NMIMS in Mumbai, and a few of the IITs and IIMs. So I will given your interest, I will let my colleagues know, and someone might reach out to you. And as I said, next time when travel is possible, if I'm in India, I'll reach out and maybe I can come by and have a chat. Because we are really trying
most welcome
with Indian University.
Most welcome, Dr. Ananish.
Please visit us.
Thank you very much. I hope that was
thank you.